Hey guys, welcome back to Weekends with Anna and Michael. So we just wrapped up our interview with Aaron Bastani, and we want to just, do a little debrief and discuss some additional points. One thing that I wanted to bring up, and I think this is important when you discuss power that progressives have versus power that the Democratic establishment has in the United States. We have to also think about like various transactional relationships that the Democratic Party has with the very people or organizations that progressives need to have deeper ties to. So, for instance, as important as labor unions are, we need to consider how, labor unions themselves, especially the most powerful labor unions, do their own lobbying toward the Democratic Party in order to get certain things that they need. And there are establishment Democrat types like Nancy Pelosi who have helped them accomplish some of their goals. And so that's power. That's a transaction that increases the power of the very people we've been fighting against within our own party. And so there needs to be a discussion about what to do to kind of like reset that situation, right? Because I think a point that you make candidly, Michael, and I don't really hear it anywhere else, maybe because it's a very difficult message to even consume or consider. The progressive arm of the Democratic Party clearly does not have the type of power that it needs, right? We're not as powerful as some of us might think we are. If we were, then the Joe Biden as a candidate wouldn't very candidly say that he's considering Republicans in top level positions within his administration. That was a recent interview that Joe Biden did, and he admitted that. And so over and over again, the Democrats show that they have no interest in catering to what we need, right? Or what we want. They'll bully us if we decide we don't want to vote for the Democratic candidate, but they do nothing to cater to us. They do nothing to appeal to us. And it's because they genuinely don't feel that they need to.
Yeah. And the thing is they don't right now. I mean, I think, again, this is part of like being really real about where we're at. And I think goes forward with some, like important strategic questions about how we actually move forward. And I want to just say, like, the incredible, positive, amazing thing about the Bernie Sanders campaign, both campaigns, that will keep into the future is that tons of people were trained in some form of how to do political engagement or actual tactics of organizing. A lot of people came to some form of class consciousness, recognition of real interests and who's opposed to those interests, obviously throughout corporate America and in both parties. So these are really positive things. It's not in any way about being like a bummer or anything like that. But you see it in all of these sort of like impotent responses. Like, okay, and there's a really good piece in Jacobin by a friend of mine, a guy I've just started to get to know a little bit, whose name I'm completely, I apologize, just totally spacing. I'm not getting enough sleep. But it was basically something to the effect of just even the argument about whether or not it's in the Democratic Party or a third party is just the cart before the horse. Mm-hmm. And this also echoes a conversation, I'll do my fourth citation of Adolph Reed, of it doesn't matter in a certain way. Like if you create a third party vehicle on a state level whose primary means are to activate people into politics in a generational sense, then that can be useful. The Bernie Sanders campaign did that, so it's incredibly useful. Various campaigns of people going on strike or organizing for Medicare for all, those are the various ways in which people can start to congeal together and build power. And then when actual power is built, who knows how it will manifest. But again, it just isn't there yet. And I think, there's one tendency to think that some type of kind of like symbolic self-immolation will do something, which just won't. Like I get it. You're pissed off. You're disgusted. You hate these people. Great. Totally. A third party vote, Trump reelected, not good. Biden elected, I would say slightly less relentlessly damaging, but not good. Because then you hear the other thing of people's like, oh, we've got these platform committees and all that stuff. That stuff doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. It's irrelevant. It's silly. And the big takeaway again is just that we really lost. And I think with regards to the labor unions and that sort of contingent of the Democratic Party, that's an interesting thing to look at. And I think that maybe to some element, that's where the future is, because there is a difference in where I will defend these unions, even though they're not being strategic, they're not being visionary or aggressive. And of course they cape for all sorts of trash politicians like Biden or Pelosi or whatever. But at the same time, what they're trying to do is protect little tiny slices that they can still deliver real things for in a completely gutted, deindustrialized economy. And I really do think that, and this is why I wish the campaign not only recognized that it was a Sanders and Biden race from the beginning, but also that instead of worrying about, how many people that you can like persuade in the Warren coalition, which isn't that many people, that like, no, Bernie actually has better blog posts than your candidate, that you really went and you looked at what would it take to persuade, someone like my grandmother, frankly, I've been mentioning, who's, worked in unionized job her whole life, who certainly has a connection and respect for people, frankly, like Roosevelt and Truman, does not dislike Bernie at all, but is also, she's older. She's not going to vibe with some of the rhetoric. She's going to feel comfortable with Joe Biden, and so I think that maybe there's a path there, and something that needs to happen is on one hand, this supporting these movements that are arising in terms of like spontaneous labor strikes and rent strikes and things like that. But on the other hand, I think there actually needs to be more bridges built, if they can be, between people on this kind of new left, kind of like downwardly mobile, overeducated millennials and traditional labor groups. And we have to see what comes out of those conversations.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think you're 100% right. I don't blame these labor groups for the transactional relationship they have with the Democrats that fight progressives. I think that in this context, it makes sense for what they need for their workers. But what you just said is absolutely right. We need to think about how progressives can forge a relationship with these labor unions that's powerful enough to overcome the power that's been given to these Democrats. Because, when we have these conversations about labor unions, in some cases endorsing, without any of their workers having a say, endorsing people like Nancy Pelosi, we have to ask why. It's not because the labor union's leadership is necessarily bad. There are transactions behind the scenes that we need to think about. We need to think about what the deliverables are to these unions, because, fact of the matter is, when it comes to actual policy, like perfect example is the Medicare for All debate that happened during the primaries. So you keep hearing from establishment Democrats that the unions are against Medicare for All because they've fought so hard for the health care that they've provided for their employees, right? So there's, again, a transactional relationship that's being protected, that's being cited in the middle of these debates. Now, we all know that Medicare for All would not only improve the lives of the workers who are under that union, but it would improve the lives of all Americans, regardless of whether they're in a union or not. And so, again, it's not to shame the unions for having that kind of relationship. It's to understand why they have it and to start thinking strategically of how we can build that type of relationship to broaden our base, our coalition, and, just move the power structure in a more favorable direction.
Exactly. And the only other thing I'll add to that is that this is also where, and I'll cite Paul O'Connell again, because these conversations are on my mind, where he's like, this is where you really do need a politics that is rooted in some understanding of where people's relationships to the economy are, and not just about like doing the right thing or having the right values or things like that, right? Because you got to go to people where they're actually at. And I think one of the paradoxes of that is when you kind of drop the moralism and the missionary vibe and try to really look at what people are doing in terms of trying to guard their material interest or think strategically about why they're doing what they're doing, it actually is, you become much less arrogant and much more open, and you actually listen to people a lot more closely. And then that actually becomes part of the project of making a left project much more mass appeal.
Definitely. Yeah. Because the moralism and the just the judgy nature of some of these conversations, I think turns people off to what progressives want to fundamentally accomplish.
Absolutely. I don't know if we talked about this on air, but we know as an example that both parties are horrifying in terms of housing policies and generate homelessness and will not deal with this issue in any way substantively, right? And obviously I speak as somebody who's dealt with housing insecurity significant times in my life. And then, if somebody owns a nail salon or a small business and they're like, hey, there's an encampment in front of my store. Now, if they become Republican, so I want to call the cops and terrorize these people, well, obviously, fuck that person. We're just doing different things. But then conversely, if somebody says, I get all of that, and this is tricky for how I go about my day to day, I'm sorry. It's just not going to be good enough to say well, you're wrong for even thinking that, because again, you're never going to have a conversation with anybody from any walk of life who's in that situation, including people who might have amazing political values and be enormously contributing to their communities, who wouldn't find that a challenge. And it doesn't mean I have the answer. I just mean even just having the ability to have a open dialogue about that, is so important for, in fact, generating the kinds of policies that will house people.
Yeah, I think you're so right. And I don't think we had this conversation publicly, but I do want to share something from a way more personal perspective to kind of highlight what you're talking about. So for instance, in the middle of this pandemic, there is a movement to ensure that people aren't forced to pay rent because so many people aren't able to work. As I've mentioned, 22 million people have been laid off. And so it's absolutely ridiculous to expect people to pay their rent. And so I think some of the dialogue coming from the left needs to be more specific. Okay. So for instance, my dad came here as an immigrant, worked as a welder. By the way, he had an electrical engineering degree in Armenia, but it meant nothing when he came here. So he starts working as a welder, and he actually had a pretty good job, but that got shipped abroad. And then he starts working as a handyman, taking any job possible, and he just was collecting anything that he could to make a down payment on an apartment building. So that's his retirement. This small 8-unit or 6-unit apartment building is the property that he relies on for his income, right? He's now in his mid 70s and, can't do difficult labor. And so this pandemic hits, and my dad, who's consistently rented his apartments under market value because most of his tenants are college students or people who are older and have fixed income, he comes to me and he's like, okay, look, this is the money I rely on for my retirement, but I'm not going to ask them to pay me rent, right? If they can and they want to, that's fine. But I'm not going to demand that they pay me rent. So what can we do though? Cause I need to live, I need to pay my bills, right? So we work something out. Luckily, I'm still working and I can, take care of things if need be. Yeah. But at the same time, the rhetoric about landlords is not specific enough because it demonizes all landlords, when in reality, we need to focus on the corporate landlords. These massive corporations that buy up apartment buildings throughout the country do not care about their tenants, do not care about ensuring that people are, not overburdened by their housing costs. These are, vicious corporatists that don't care about average people and they just want to make money. It's fine to have conversations about them, but I think we're too general in demonizing all landlords, because there are a ton of people in like LA especially, these private citizens who have like one building, they put their entire life savings into it because that's their retirement, and they have a personal relationship with their tenants and they love them. And, when my dad sees that rhetoric of the left, and we've talked about this, he gets turned off and he feels like he's made to be the enemy. And so I think precision also matters in the way that we communicate things.
100%. I'll add two things to that. So one, I can hear some pushback to that, which I actually think in some ways is valid, but it goes in the opposite direction of overheated rhetoric, which is like part of the critique is just like the very function of like a rentier economy, which has nothing to do, like, you can understand why that is a systems problem in capitalism, and that really actually has nothing to do, like, one of the things that I actually liked about my read of Marxism is it's very non-moralistic. It could be like, that clearly the fact that like it is advantageous to passively own property over working is an indictment of how we've designed things. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't mean that you personally doing that on a small scale is like, oh, you're a bad person or some type of thing. Now, obviously, first of all, as you're right, the easy and clear point is just center it, like, the predatory, New York or all these other places are run by these disgusting predator companies that run tens of thousands of people's lives, have no concern or care or whatever. And also, there are mom and pop landlords that are scumbags too.
Oh,
but
for sure.
If you look at it as a function instead of as like an individual decision, that's number one. The second point I want to make too is, and I think this is like also about getting real about the left reaching the mass. And I think it's like really paradoxical because there's a lot of focus, rightly, obviously, in the age of Trump on, racism and xenophobia and abuse of asylum seekers and immigrants. But sometimes it goes into like, again, very utopian rhetoric, which has no immediate relevancy, like about open borders, while at the same time, and I could tell you, like, it's your dad, it's like, anybody that you've talked to from any first, second, or third generation immigrant community, and I'm talking from a really broad set, Eastern Europe, the Caribbean, Africa, Asia, like, if you don't at least have a rhetorical ability to frankly respect the hustle in like a very real sense, like people having 3 businesses and driving cars and doing accounting and trying to get into real estate, that you have to have some explanation of like why the game is rigged or unhelpful in them doing that. And maybe some other answers about how life can be better for all. But if you come, especially a political movement that is represented by a lot of like downwardly mobile but still privileged people, that's just a political disaster. And you're not going to be able to build a relationship with, Mr. Kasparian.
Yeah. And my dad, he has the right like intentions and instincts.
Yeah.
So, but like, and it's not just about housing, it's about the entire system and how it's all interwoven. So for instance, this was his plan because this is what he needed in order to eventually be able to retire, right? He can't live off of what Social Security gives him. By the way, if it were up to Republicans, Social Security would be completely gutted. People couldn't even rely on that. So in his mind, he's like, damn, I'm self-employed. I'm now a handyman, right? So there's no 401k, there's no retirement fund, there's nothing. So what is my plan for when I can't do these jobs anymore because of my old age? So you're right. It is an issue with how our system is set up. And rather than demonize, private citizens who do what they literally need to do to survive, I think the important thing is to focus on how to change that system so people feel like they don't have to be landlords. They don't have to have this kind of like plan to fall back on when they're not able to physically work anymore.
Exactly. And it should always be about addition, not subtraction.